It started with a whisper. I remember that much, because it was the first thing that sent a chill down my spine. The whisper wasn't like a voice, more like a faint brushing against the walls of my skull. But I couldn't ignore it, couldn't push it out of my head. It sat there, festering, waiting for me to acknowledge it. You won't believe me when I tell you that, in the beginning, I thought it was just the house settling. That's what I kept telling myself. A house this old had its creaks and groans, its strange noises, right? It was a century-old Victorian that I had bought on impulse, hoping to escape the noise of the city and start fresh. I needed peace. What I got instead, though, was the kind of silence that presses in on you, like the walls are closing in and the air itself is suffocating, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. It was the smell that first hit me when I unlocked the front door. A sickly, pungent odor that lingered in the air like something rotting. Not the familiar scent of old wood or musty floors, but something worse, something unnatural. I should have turned around and walked right back out. Should have called the real estate agent and demanded to know why the house smelled like death, but I didn't. I chalked it up to old plumbing, a long-forgotten pipe maybe, and carried on. The house was beautiful in its own way, grand, towering, like something straight out of a Gothic novel. The floors were creaky oak, the ceilings high and adorned with ornate moldings. There was a wide staircase that curled upward, and every room felt as though it held secrets, though none of them were welcome. The musty scent lingered throughout, never leaving, but I kept telling myself it was just the age of the place, that nothing more sinister could be at play. I spent the first day unpacking, ignoring the weird way the floors felt unnaturally cold underfoot and how the windows seemed to trap the sunlight, refusing to let it warm the space. My exhaustion from the move made me dismiss the creeping sense of unease. By nightfall, the house was silent except for the occasional groan of its wooden frame and the soft hum of the refrigerator. But then I heard it. First, it was nothing. A whisper, barely audible, that felt like it was coming from just behind the walls. It was faint enough that I thought it was nothing, just the wind, maybe. But then I noticed something else. The silence returned too quickly. And then, the smell, that rancid stench, came back in full force. It was stronger now, as if it had been festering for days or even years, just waiting to find a way to crawl out into the open. I found myself standing in the middle of the hallway, frozen, as the air thickened with that horrible odor. My stomach churned, and I couldn't breathe. I wanted to leave. I should have left, but curiosity, that damn trait of mine, got the better of me. I followed the smell down the hallway, toward the stairs that led to the basement. It was strange, there was no logical reason for the smell to be coming from there, yet my feet moved on their own accord. As if the house itself was guiding me, the basement door was hidden behind a faded velvet curtain, a thick, red thing that was already fraying at the edges. I pulled it back, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I touched the old wood. It wasn't locked, strangely enough, but the handle felt cold and almost unnatural. I turned it and opened the door, wincing as it creaked in protest. A blast of cold air hit me, and I stepped down onto the first step. The smell hit me like a wall, like a decaying animal, mixed with something metallic and sweet. I gagged, my chest tightening. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. There was something down there. Something waiting. I turned on the light at the top of the stairs, but the bulb flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows. The basement itself was vast, far larger than I had expected for a house this old. The walls were stone, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, save for a few items that seemed to have been abandoned long ago. Furniture covered in white sheets, crates filled with old, broken things, and something else. In the far corner of the basement, partially obscured by a large, rusted furnace, there was something moving. The shadows seemed to bend around it as if it didn't belong in this world. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just an illusion brought on by my mind playing tricks. But then I saw it again. The movement, like something shifting beneath a heavy blanket. Slowly, with a feeling of dread crawling down my spine, I stepped closer. I don't know what I expected to find, maybe a rat, or some other pest. But what I saw was worse. Much worse. A shape, a figure, hunched low to the ground, its limbs twisted in a grotesque, unnatural way. It wasn't fully visible at first, but the smell, that disgusting smell, seemed to be emanating from it. I felt my stomach churn again, bile rising in my throat. I turned to leave, but I couldn't move. It was as if the very air had thickened, trapping me in place, and then it spoke. But it wasn't a voice. Not really. It was more like a low, guttural growl, too faint to make sense of at first. The sound was awful, a mix of hunger and something far darker. Leave. It rasped out. I finally snapped out of my daze, stumbling backward, tripping over my own feet. The door slammed shut behind me before I could reach it, and the darkness closed in, thicker now, the smell stronger, more suffocating. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever I had seen down there wasn't human. And it wasn't going to let me leave. When I woke up, I was in my bed. The light from the lamp beside me was steady, and the house felt eerily silent. But the smell was still there. I could feel it, lingering in the back of my throat. And I knew, deep down, that whatever I had glimpsed in that basement wasn't going anywhere. It had been waiting for someone like me. Someone foolish enough to think they could ignore it. But it wasn't just the smell or the figure that haunted me. It was what I couldn't remember, what had happened in that basement when I'd blacked out. The next day, I went back to the basement. I couldn't help myself. I had to know what it was. But the room was empty. Just dust, empty crates, and that cold, damp air that made every step feel wrong. But the whisper came again, and this time, I knew it was speaking to me. I should have left. I should have packed my things and walked away from that house the second I felt the first hint of something wrong. But I didn't. I stayed, drawn into the web of the house's dark secrets, like a moth circling a flame it could never escape. The next few days blurred together. Every corner of the house felt like it was watching me, waiting. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the silence so thick that it seemed to press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. And in those moments, I'd hear it again, the whisper, so faint but unmistakable. The words slithered into my mind, colder than the winter air, "You can't leave." At first, I told myself it was my imagination. The house was old, after all. It had a history, one I didn't want to know. I told myself it was just the stress, the exhaustion from my move. But every time I tried to ignore it, to brush it off, I found myself drawn back to that basement. The thing in the corner, whatever it was, had stayed with me. I could almost feel it, like a shadow moving just behind my eyes. I tried to reach out to others. Neighbors, the local real estate agent, even the previous owner, anyone who might have a clue about the house's history. But no one had much to say. The neighbors were distant, curt, and quick to change the subject when I asked about the house. The real estate agent was polite but dismissive, insisting that there were no issues with the property. And the previous owner, a reclusive man who had sold the place under mysterious circumstances, he refused to answer my calls. It was as though the house itself had sealed itself off from the rest of the world, wrapping itself in an impenetrable veil of silence. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Come down," it would say. "Come back." I tried to resist. I tried to go about my days, pretending everything was fine. But every night, when the shadows stretched long and the house creaked with age, I found myself standing at the edge of the basement door again, staring down into the pitch-black darkness below. It was an impossible pull, a gravitational force that I couldn't ignore. There was something I was missing. Something I had to know. It was on the fifth night, when the air felt colder than usual, that I finally descended again. The smell, thick and oppressive, hit me the moment my foot touched the first step. This time, the basement felt different. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The shadows clung to the walls, warping the space in ways that didn't seem natural. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my hand on the railing, eyes scanning the basement in the dim light. The furnace was still there, its rusted surface catching the faint light. But this time, there was something new, something moving. It wasn't in the corner anymore. It was right there, in the middle of the room. A figure, barely visible at first, huddled in the darkness. And yet, somehow, I could sense it more clearly than I had ever sensed anything in my life. I could feel its presence like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. "Don't come any closer," I heard a voice say. It wasn't the whisper this time. It was a full, guttural voice, rough and ragged, but undeniably real. It seemed to echo in my bones. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. It was the same thing. The thing that had been in the basement when I first found it. But now it was closer. And now, I could see it more clearly. It had no shape, at least, not one I could understand. Its body was contorted, misshapen, like it was composed of limbs that shouldn't belong together. Its skin was pale, sickly, and stretched too tight over its bones. I could see dark veins crisscrossing its form, pulsing with some kind of strange, unnatural rhythm. The stench, God, the smell, was unbearable, so thick it felt like it was coating the inside of my mouth, and yet, despite the grotesque horror of its appearance, I couldn't look away. I felt rooted to the spot, my body refusing to move as if some invisible force was holding me in place. The thing's head tilted to the side, its eyes, if you could even call them that, narrow slits of black, void-like sockets, staring at me with an intensity that burned. "You shouldn't have come back," it rasped, its voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "But now that you're here, you're mine." The basement seemed to grow colder, the air thickening as the thing stepped forward. Each movement was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. And I was afraid, more afraid than I had ever been in my life. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that house and never look back, but I didn't run. Instead, I did the opposite. I stepped forward. I don't know why. Some dark part of me, buried deep inside, wanted to see it, wanted to understand it. It was as if I was powerless to stop myself. And so, I took one step, then another, drawing closer to the thing that should have made me turn and flee. It didn't stop me. Instead, it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You're not the first," it hissed, a foul, wet sound that made my skin crawl. "You won't be the last." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But all I could do was watch as it stepped closer, its body twisting and contorting in ways that defied nature. It reached out, and I felt a coldness wash over me as its fingers brushed against my skin. Its touch was like ice, freezing my blood in my veins. I tried to pull away, but my body didn't respond. I was trapped. Not in the basement, but in its gaze. In its presence. It leaned in, its breath rank and heavy on my face, and whispered in a voice that crawled into my soul, "You shouldn't have come down here. Now you'll never leave." Suddenly, I felt the walls of the basement close in on me. The space grew smaller, suffocating, as if the house itself was swallowing me whole. The last thing I remember was the overwhelming sense of dread, the feeling of my body being pulled under, consumed by something far older and darker than anything I could comprehend. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer in the basement. The sensation of being crushed by the weight of the world had lifted, but it was replaced by something else. A deep, suffocating silence that felt like a shroud over my mind. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and the taste of iron lingered in the back of my throat. I was lying on the cold, hard floor, but I didn't know how long I had been there. How long I had been unconscious. How long it had been since I last saw the thing, but I knew one thing, it was still down there. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me as though I hadn't used them in days. The basement door was still open, standing at the top of the stairs like a dark invitation. A whisper, cold and sinister, slipped through the cracks of my mind. "Come back." I stumbled towards the stairs, but the moment I looked down into the abyss below, I hesitated. The basement was darker than I remembered, the shadows seeming to stretch farther and deeper than before. My body screamed at me to leave, to get away from that place, but something else, the same force that had drawn me there in the first place, pulled me closer. I couldn't stop myself. I stepped down onto the first stair, then the next, until my feet were back on the ground that had almost swallowed me whole. The basement felt different now, more oppressive. The air was thick with something, presence. Something inescapable, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, watching, waiting, and there it was. The thing. It was standing in the same corner as before, but now, its form seemed to writhe and distort even more, like it was made of darkness itself, too hideous for my eyes to comprehend. It twisted, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as though they were fighting to hold its shape. I could hear it moving, its body stretching and contracting, a sickening slithering noise that crawled under my skin. Its eyes locked onto mine. Those black, hollow sockets that seemed to pierce through my very soul. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, the voice like 1,000 whispers in my ear. "But now you've seen the truth. And the truth has a price." I wanted to turn away, to scream, to beg for it to stop, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor. I could feel it now, its influence, crawling up my spine, wrapping its cold fingers around my heart. The thing stepped forward, its long, clawed fingers reaching out for me, its grotesque face contorting into something that resembled a smile. "You've opened the door, and now it's mine to control. Your knowledge, your curiosity has sealed your fate," it rasped. I wanted to ask what it meant. I wanted to understand why I couldn't leave, why the house felt like it was alive, breathing with a pulse that echoed in my chest. But the words caught in my throat, and all that came out was a strangled gasp. The thing's twisted form shuddered with a low growl. "You're not the first to search for answers," it continued. "And you won't be the last. The house, this place, is old. It's older than you can comprehend, older than anything you've ever known. And it's hungry." The words were like poison in my veins. I could feel the weight of its truth sinking into my bones. The house wasn't just a house. It was a prison. A living entity, trapped between realms, hungry for souls to feed on. I had thought it was the house that was haunted, that the stench and the whispers were merely signs of its age, its decay. But I was wrong. It wasn't the house that was dying, it was the thing beneath it. The thing that had fed on the souls of every tenant before me. The thing that had used the house as its prison, a trap to lure in the curious, the foolish, the lost. And now, it was trying to do the same to me. I was its prisoner. And it was starving. My chest tightened, a knot of terror that grew tighter with every breath. The thing took another step forward, and I felt my legs tremble. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I realized with sickening clarity, it was too late. I had already opened the door. I had already seen it. And now, there was no escape. But then, something unexpected happened. A sound, sharp and sudden, broke through the tension. A knock. Then another. A frantic pounding, coming from upstairs. The thing hissed, its grotesque features twitching in agitation. It recoiled, its mouth opening in a soundless snarl as if it could sense what I could not. Someone was here. Someone was trying to get in. I heard the door to the house slam open. Footsteps rushed down the hall. I wanted to shout, to scream for help, but my voice was nothing more than a dry croak. My mind scrambled for a way to warn whoever it was to leave, but it was too late. The thing's form seemed to flicker and shudder in the shadows, as if it were already reaching out to them. The footsteps drew closer, and then, he appeared. A man, tall, disheveled, his eyes wild and bloodshot, like someone who had seen too much. His face was pale, the skin drawn tight across his bones. The moment his eyes locked with mine, I knew he was one of the previous owners. Someone who had stayed too long, someone who had learned the truth about the house and lived to tell the tale, at a terrible cost. "Get out." I managed to croak, my voice a broken whisper. "It's in the basement." "Don't," but the man didn't listen. He stepped forward, toward the stairs. Toward the thing, and the thing saw him. The thing moved. Before I could even shout again, it had crossed the room in the blink of an eye, its jagged, bony fingers lashing out toward the man. He screamed, a sound of pure terror, and I watched helplessly as he was consumed by the darkness, swallowed whole by the thing in the corner. I could hear his body crack, bones snapping as he was bent and twisted. His scream cut off abruptly, and then, nothing. The basement was silent once more, and then I understood. The thing had fed. It had fed on his fear, on his life force, and now it was stronger than before. It would wait, biding its time, until another curious soul wandered in. Another person to fall victim to the hunger of the house. As I looked around the room, the cold, suffocating silence closing in on me, I knew that I had made a terrible mistake. I had uncovered something that was never meant to be known. And now, I was trapped. Forever, there would be no escape.